All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back now in the middle of our festivals, Moedim, the appointments of God. And we established that in Passover, God gave us the background of substitutional atonement. We established that in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, He, in a very real way, told us to get out the leaven we brought from Egypt and to take the starter dough and what was familiar to us and pull it out, and to have the unleavened bread. And a time of, let's say, unique cleansing might be in order there. We also looked at the fact that the day after the Sabbath after Passover, first fruits was introduced, but there's one more festival that goes with the spring Moedim. There's one more, and that is plus 50 days after Passover. There's yet another one. And if you have still open your Bible all the way back in Leviticus 23, you'll find it specifically in 23:17. But you'll also find it in the Numbers 28 passage that we were looking at. Read someone Leviticus 23:17 out loud, please.
You shall bring in from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread for a wave offering made of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour, baked with leaven as first fruits to the Lord.
Okay, if you look at the verse before that in 16, it says 50 days after Passover, you are to count seven Sabbaths, 7 times 7 is 49, and the 50th day after Passover is the time that we're going to call, in Hebrew, it's called Shavuot. I got to write this better so you can see. Shavuot. Shavua is week. Sheva is 7. Shavuot, weeks. The Feast of Weeks. In the Greek, they pick up the idea of 50, and that is called Pentecost. Pentecost is 50 days. Shavuot is 7 sevens, 7 weeks. Okay, it's the same festival. It's just different. Pentecost is from the Greek. Shavuot is the Hebrew from Sheva, from 7. Sevens. Okay? Now, the Feast of Weeks is the Feast of Pentecost. What happened at Pentecost in the Hebrew Scriptures? For the answer to this question, go back to Exodus 19, and for something that you skipped in Exodus 19 when you were reading through it. When we were teaching through Exodus 19, I want you to see, remember, let's do the overall timeline for Exodus. There came about a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. In Exodus chapter 1, God raised up as a result of that what he always does. He raises up a leader. That's Moses. And in Exodus 1, 2, and 3, you have the story of the background of Moses. And then God sends him away to the Midianite seminary in the wilderness, where he gets a wife, because that's what you do in seminary. And he ends up in 4, 5, and 6. And then Exodus 6 through 12, 10 plagues come down on Egypt. Then 12, the Passover, we quit Egypt today, lock, stock, and bagels, we go into the wilderness. 12 through 15, our back is to the sea, we cannot escape. God parts the waters, we go through the waters, the horse and rider are swallowed up in the sea. And in 15, Moses is singing, Miriam is breakdancing, and the place is coming apart. Someone checks the canteens and finds out, guess what? There is no water. And now we're heading into summer, and we've got no water. And 15 to 19 is the journey to the mountain of the law. And as they're coming up on the journey to the mountain of the law, they are going through some early experiences like Mara, bitterness, Elim, where lots of wells of water are, and they water everyone. In chapter 18, Moses gets smacked by his father-in-law because of the way he is handling the people, and he needs to stop making everybody come to the Moses show and break it up and not try to be in charge of everything, because it's killing him. Then you get to chapter 19. Pick up your reading in 19:1. In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land. This is, by the way, 50 days after 12:18. Okay? In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day that they came into the wilderness of Sinai, when they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. 50 days after Passover, they got to the mountain of the law. This 50 days is the journey from Exodus 12 to 19. That took 50 days from the time they left in Passover till the time they got there. There's a payoff for knowing this, so hang in there again, and if you hang in, you'll get the idea. What I know is that something happened at the mountain of the law. Now, you know that 20, 21, 22, 23 is going to be the law, right? But go back to what happened at the mountain. In verse 3, it says, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." Here's the thing. If you want to follow me, I will lead you, God says. Did you notice how he said it? If you will follow, I will lead. I want you to pretend that God holds up his hands and says, okay, we can dance, but you got to follow or I'm not leading. And he sets it up and he says, show me you want to follow me and I will lead you. In a way, he's saying, draw near to me and then I'll draw near to you. You got to come first, then I'll do. That's what he says. Then he says, so Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded. All the people answered together and said, all the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. Now, notice that Moses is going between the people and God. He's acting as the intermediary, the priest. Okay? Because the priesthood's not set up yet. He's the guy. Now, it says, Lord said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud so that the people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe in you forever. Then Moses told the words of the Lord, of the people to the Lord. The Lord also said to Moses, go to the people, consecrate them today and tomorrow, let them wash their garments, let them be ready for the 3rd day. On the 3rd day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You'll set bounds for all the people all around. Beware that you do not go up to the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain will surely be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, washed their garments, said to them, be ready for the 3rd day. Do not go near a woman. So it came about on the 3rd day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound. And all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. I want you to see it. He says, get ready, get clean. Don't have any relations with each other. Everybody get ready, be consecrated, come, and when you hear the trumpet, that'll call all of Israel out here to be with one voice. You'll be standing there. I'm going to go up on the mountain and meet with God. But notice what you see happened in the presentation. In Exodus 19, you can see in 10 through 12, verses 10 through 12, weird weather. What happens is that they were all with one accord, it says, they were all together. And what happened when they all got together in one place? 19:16, verse 16 says the weather looked weird. It says there was lightning flashes and a thick cloud and a trumpet sound coming. So they're all with one accord in one place, and there's this incredible wind that comes down and weather that comes down and flashes of lightning come down. And then in 1918, now Mount Sinai was all in smoke because the Lord descended on it in what? In fire. And the smoke descended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked. And so in verse 18, there was a fire that came down on the mountain. And all the people stood there watching what God was doing. And it says that that the Lord spoke to Moses, go down, warn the people that they do not break through, verse 21, I'm sorry, so that they do not break through to the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. Also, let the priests who come near to the Lord consecrate themselves, or else the Lord will break out against them. And here the term priest, Cohen, is probably the families or patriarchs of the leader. The priesthood is not set up yet, so it's probably not the priesthood as we know it, but rather those who stood before the people. Now, here's the problem with Exodus. I walked you from, there came about a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, all the way up through standing at the mountain of the law. Cut to the law. Go up on top of the mountain. Meanwhile, on top of the mountain, God is telling Moses the following things. And from Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23, split the screen, you're up on the mountain. 24, you're back down at the bottom. Flip over to 24, you're back down at the bottom, and I'm pushing you through the book so that you can see the story. And when you're back down on the bottom, the people are affirming that they're going to stand in dependence of God, and it says that he said to Moses, 24:1, come up to the Lord, and you and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and the 70 elders of Israel, and you shall worship at a distance. And so now Moses comes down, gives the law, right, or tells them of the law, and he's not brought the law down to them yet, but he's told them that God is giving them the law. But he comes down to call these 70 elders to come up and have a little banquet time together and sit on the mountain. And verse 7, it says, he took the book or the declaration of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. So God has told him laws to give them. He's given them some core codes of the law, but they don't yet have the law in their possession. Stay tuned. In 25, you're back into the tabernacle. 26, tabernacle. 27, tabernacle. 28, tabernacle. 29, tabernacle. 30, tabernacle. 31, tabernacle. 31, 12 to 18. There's a time for the Sabbath. Now turn into 32. Stay with me because I promise it'll make sense. And that's so rarely happens in this class. So stay with me, and it's going to mean something to you. 32:1. Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled around Aaron and said to him, come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Moses goes back up, and he doesn't come down. And they're waiting for him to come down to bring the tablets of the law and to complete the whole study of the law. They've already sworn that they will follow God and they'll follow the core codes of civility that he's given them heretofore. But guess what? Moses went up. He didn't call. He didn't write. He didn't fax. He didn't email. Not a smoke signal. Nothing. Now we're down here. We don't know what's going on. And it says, Aaron said to them, tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me. Now, what is the earring? It's a symbol of slavery. Take out the symbol of your Egyptian slavery. In other words, set your ear free from the symbol of slavery and give that to me. Verse 3, then they all tore off the gold rings. Verse 4, they took them from their hand, fashioned it with an engraving tool, and made it into a molten calf. They said, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you from the land of Egypt. Then when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. But he's talking about the calf. Now stop. Up on the mountain, Joshua was up there part way up. There's Moses with God, Joshua, and some elders on the mountain. Down at the bottom are the people following a calf and Aaron. And it says, verse 17 of chapter 32, when Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, this is the next day when they're doing their celebration, he said, this is the sound of war in the camp. But he said, it is not the sound of the cry of triumph, nor is it the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear. Moses says, Josh, you're right, you hear a noise, but that's not a war. That's singing. Now, Moses is coming down and he is getting hot. I mean, he is angry. And when he comes down out of there, He is absolutely fuming. Remember, what does he do? I don't need to tell you the story, you know it. What does he do? He's got the tablets of the law. It's not 1 to 5, 6 to 10. It's 1 to 10, 1 to 10. And he breaks both tablets of the law, both testimonies. What's wrong with that? He broke God's copy, and God didn't tell him to. If he wanted to break their copy, I don't know that God would have had the same problem. But God says, you don't get to tell me what I'm doing, and that's my copy. Now, what's interesting is, as he comes down, you see in verse 28 these words. The sons of Levi did as Moses instructed. They went out and killed the people that were involved in the debauchery and the misbehavior before the calf. How many people died? So in 32, verse 28, 3,000 people died. All right, here's what I want you to see. The next time you see Pentecost in Scripture, Shavuot, is in Acts chapter 2. So turn in your Bible to Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. And now you should see it. In Acts chapter 2, verse 1, it says, somebody read 2:1 nice and loud.
When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place.
Okay. They were with one accord. Somebody read 2 nice and loud.
And suddenly there came from heaven a noise like a violent rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting.
And the weather changed in the room. This is 2:1, 2:2. And then, somebody read verse 3 nice and loud.
And there appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributing themselves, and they rested on each one of them.
And fire appeared in the room. Now drop all the way down to 2:41. Nice and loud.
So then, those who had received his word were baptized, and that day there were added about 3,000 souls.
Do you see it? Pentecost 1 was the giving of the law in which 3,000 people died. Pentecost 2 was the giving of the Spirit in which 3,000 people lived eternally. Now the point of the passage is when you get to Acts 2, you're supposed to know what's already happened. If you don't know Pentecost 1, then Pentecost 2 doesn't make any sense. Do you see how he patterned himself exactly after the first event? This is a sequel. Acts 2 said, with the coming of the law brought the knowledge of our death, but with the coming of the Spirit brought the inner knowledge of life everlasting. That's what he's trying to tell you in Acts 2. But you're never going to get it if you don't know Exodus 19 and Exodus 32 and what the story's about. Acts 2 doesn't make any sense. It's just a cool story about how God has these little flaming tongues and wind blowing. All the details of the New Testament writer, in this case Dr. Luke, are picked up from Exodus 19 and Exodus 32, assuming that you have already become so Bibline in your blood that you know what the first story's about. So let me stop here and say, you're never going to understand the New Testament if you don't know the Old. You're never going to understand it. The main points the writers are making will make no sense. And it is because we have New Testament churches with New Testament believers without the law and the understanding that they are operating on principles that they've invented in the air. Their feet are firmly planted in mid-air. They can't get it. And that's how you come up with people from the church, from pulpits, espousing things that are absolutely the opposite of what God thinks. Because they're reading the verses, but they don't know what they mean. There's a backstory. Aside from Star Wars, nobody can really pull off prequels that well. Okay? So the bottom line is, you don't start here and then learn this. You start here and then learn this. That's how you understand the story. I think I made my point so I can push past it. Here's what I'm saying. 50 days after Passover is the Bible readathon in the local synagogue. 50 days after Passover marks the giving of the law. When someone asks what was Pentecost, it was an agricultural festival timed with the arrival of Sinai so that God gave the law there. It was also a memorial of 3,000 dead people because of the way they received the law. But it is also the time, the very same time, is the time when the Spirit of God came on them and wrote the law in their hearts. It's all of those things. Okay? Questions?
So Exodus 19, you're saying, is the first Pentecost, it is 50 days after the Passover?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And you have to go to the very first 9 verses of chapter 12, sync the Hebrew of the verses with the timing, verses 12:14, Exodus 12:14, and that's how you'll know there's 50 days between. That gets you through all the spring festivals, but the bottom line is, did you notice in 23:17 of Leviticus 23:17, when you're talking about the feast of Shavuot, that something weird happened? Because all of that doesn't tell you why I told you this story. 23:17, how do you celebrate the feast of Pentecost or Shavuot in the Hebrew scriptures before the Spirit of God had come? How do you celebrate it? What do you do? Leviticus 23:17. Somebody tell me, what am I supposed to do at Shavuot? It's weird. What do I do? I bring in 2 loaves, but take a look at the loaves. What's different about these loaves? They're made with leaven. In other words, the other one was a cleaning out of leaven of the things of the world. But this one, I bring in something that came from the world and becomes part of the feast. Observe this and tell me what he's saying. Observe this and tell me what he's saying. What is the leavened loaf? There's going to be a prophecy already in the early festivals that there's coming a day when God is going to bring in from all of the world those who are going to become part of this. So what we have is Passover tells me that you're saved by personal substitution, but unleavened bread tells me that I'm sanctified by getting stuff out of my life. And first fruits says my life is different because I live now with an understanding that I shall not die. I have resurrection and eternal life. And by the way, there's coming a day when that group is going to be made up of people from all over the world that come together, and those loaves are going to be worship. So he's telling you a story, and the story is vividly portrayed, and that's only the spring. We haven't gotten to the fall yet. Okay? Anybody have questions about what we did? What I did was I went from physical to scriptural context to principle to story. That's what I did. Let's go to the autumn, because it's more in keeping with where we are in the year. And in the autumn festivals, Numbers 29:1, go back to Numbers, because that's what we're supposed to be doing. I know. You've got your fingers in Leviticus 23. You've got your fingers in Numbers 28 to 30. These are all, by the way, I could take you to Deuteronomy 16. You'll see them again. So let me put that down. Leviticus 23 tells the Levites about the Moedim, the appointments. Numbers 28, yeah, that's an 8. 28 and 29 tells the people civility, civil code about the Moedim. Deuteronomy 16 tells constitutional law. All 3 laws have the Moedim in them. All 3. Because there is no time in God's calendar where he doesn't want you to know how salvation comes, what you're supposed to do after you're saved. The story is the same for everybody in the field. That's why it's repeated in all 3 sections of law. So let's say it this way. There's only 2 things that are in all 3 laws. This and Sabbath. That's it. Calendar and Sabbath are the only things in all 3 laws. Deuteronomy has some pieces of the 10 Commandments, but it doesn't have all of the codes of law. But Leviticus does not have the 10 Commandments. So all 3 laws only appear here and Sabbath. That's it. Okay? All right. Let's take a look at Feast of Yom Teruah. That is the beginnings of the month, the Feast of Blowing, or the Feast of, sometimes called the Feast of Trumpets. 29, 1 to 6, nice and loud, please, Numbers.
7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall also have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. It will be to you a day of the blowing trumpets. You shall offer a burnt offering as a soothing aroma to the Lord, 1 bull, 1 ram, and 7 male lambs, 1 year old, without defect. Also the grain offering, fine flour mixed with oil, 3/10 of an ephah for the bull, 2/10 of the ram, and 1/10 for each of the 7 lambs. We'll offer 1 male goat for a sin offering to make atonement for you, besides the burnt offering of the new moon and its grain offering, and the continual burnt offerings and its grain offering, and their drink offerings according to their ordinance for a soothing aroma and offering by fire to the Lord.
Okay, so what you have is, when you read the passage in Numbers 29, it's pretty hard to see the simple truth about the day, but this is the opening of the Jewish sacred year. Israel doesn't have one New Year's Day. They have 4. The year starts 4 times a year, which means Jews know how to party. But it also means that they have a new year for trees. We call it Arbor Day. They have a new year for birthing of animals. They have a new year that's called the Sacred New Year, and a new year for the secular new year. And I'm going to give you a chart that's going to show you when they pop up. So the first month in one calendar is the 7th month in another. Now, what's the problem with that? It means when you're reading the Bible and it says it was the 3rd month, you got to know who's the writer. If the writer's a priest, he's using the sacred calendar. If he's a king, he's probably using the civil calendar, and they are very different times of year. So you can't, not everybody's using one calendar. You all understand that it wasn't until Julius Caesar, just before the time of Jesus, that in the West there was one calendar. Everybody had different calendars for everything. The Persians had a different calendar than the Greeks. The Greeks had a different calendar than the Latins or Romans. And so everybody was operating, and then as Julius Caesar spreads the Roman influence around the Mediterranean, by the time Augustus picks it up, he calls the calendar the Julian calendar, because Julius Caesar made it. Because when you're really, really super cool, you get to make the calendar. And that tradition, by the way, fell into our hands because our calendar throughout the West is now formed around who? Jesus, right? So Jesus sets the calendar. That was done 600 years after Jesus by a bishop by the name of Exodus. But the point is that if you're really cool, if you're somebody really important, they name the whole calendar after you, okay? Now, in antiquity, the Hebrews had several different calendar systems they followed. Why? Why would Jews have more than one calendar? They were what we call a segmented society. The problem is people who worked in shepherding had a calendar that worked around animals. People that worked in agriculture had a calendar that worked around growth. People that worked in the priestly sector had a calendar that worked around the calendar that we're showing you. People that worked in the civil ceremonies of the government had a separate calendar. So they all had to be synced together. And for a long time in the Hebrew calendar, there were 4 different New Years a year. Yom Teruah is on the 7th month, the first day of the month, you will have a holy convocation. That 7th day is the beginning of the secular calendar, but it's the 7th month of the sacred calendar. Now, what do I mean? When you start the calendar year well, you guys, you grew up with more than one calendar. You did. You grew up with a calendar that was all the calendar that started in January 1st, but you also grew up with one that started at the end of the summer. What calendar am I referring to? School calendar. And you know that in your life, in a segmented society, if you went to school, it didn't matter what the calendar said, it mattered what the school calendar said, because that's how you were going to live. That's what I'm talking about. We still have it in our lives in some ways. Okay, he says, I want you to get to the beginning of this, and God wanted Israel to know that to separate the sacred and secular violated the spirit of the Torah. So he said, right in the middle, I want you to put a New Year's Day on the calendar that has a sacred day to start your secular year. Let's say it this way. I don't know if you know, do you know what Red Mass is? Does anybody know what Red Mass is? Did you know that at the beginning of the Supreme Court session, it, by the way, just started. Do you know that the Sunday before the Supreme Court meets, there's a Mass at the National Cathedral that they all go to called Red Mass? What about separation of church and state? It's been left over. We've been doing it for 100 years. Sunday before the court meets, they go to Red Mass. And they have for 100 years. It's an interdenominational service of some sort, but it's a Mass. So that should tell you it's interdenominational sort of, except for not. And why do they do it? Because a leftover of our patriots and our early founders was that before the court could sit, they had to go before God. Now, if that word gets out, I swear to you they will take it out of the calendar. Because if it even says God, we can't do it. But it still happens. It's called Red Mass. Now, here's what's interesting. At the beginning of your secular year, God says, stop, have a holy convocation. And at the beginning, I want you to blow trumpets. And I want you to understand that the civil or secular year begins with something sacred. Let's just say that before you can even begin the calendar year of your government, you will come together and you will always worship for a time of the trumpet blowing. That's what this was about. Here's the problem. The problem with Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Blowing, or the Feast of Trumpets, is that God knew that we would box or compartmentalize sacred and secular. He knew that it would always be a temptation for people who followed him to say, there's an old Hebrew expression that business is business and Moshe is Moshe. It means there's the law and then there's business. That's not, by the way, biblical. It's just something that happens. How many of you know people who are faithful in church but do not live as Christians during the week? Okay, that's this. And he says, I want you to start your civil year with a sacred ceremony so that you can remember that even secular things are sacred at their beginning. This is like praying at a ball game. Let us begin in prayer, and then let us shout obscenities from the stands at the refs for the rest of the game. Okay? You get the picture, okay? But does everybody understand what this is? It's the first day of the 7th month, and it's also the beginning of the secular or civil calendar, but it's done with a sacred ceremony, okay? I don't want to spend more time on that, but let me just say that that also begins a count. Countdown begins here. Countdown for what? It's 1 to 10. Then on the 10th day of the 7th month, after Yom Teruah, by the way, what is this called today, Feast of Trumpets? It's called Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the beginning of the year. In the Bible, it's Yom Teruah. Here, it's called Rosh Hashanah today. So 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, what comes up? According to the verses in 29:7 through 11. What's the next festival? This is the darkest day on the calendar for Jews. All guilt is combined into one day. Live like you want, 364, but on this day, everybody feels miserable. Everybody. What is it? It's called Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And that happens 10 days after Rosh Hashanah. I want you to notice that this Yom Kippur simply means the day of the covering, the Day of Atonement, Day of the covering. Kippur, kippah is a hat, Kippur is a covering. Okay? Now look at the blood tally. If you look at verses 7 through 11, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, and on top of the daily sacrifice, and in addition to the grain and drink accompanying offerings, and the point of it is, many animals died in the replacement of people's sin. What is the point here? Very simple. High cost of sin. That's the point. And so everybody is to remember that there is no difference between sacred and secular, and there's a high cost for sin. We cannot and we must not as believers forget the important price of sin. Here's the problem we have. That's okay, you can bring it to me. Here's the problem we have as Christians. We have a disadvantage over ancient Hebrews. Guys, I want you to imagine you raised a lamb. You kept that lamb without blemish. You watched over that lamb better than you watched over your children at a pool. You took care of that lamb, and at the end of that first year of that lamb, you brought that lamb carefully all the way to the temple. You carried that lamb. You did not want to take a chance that that lamb would stumble and somehow get a blister on it. So you brought that lamb, and then you watched them as they took a knife and sliced the throat of your family pet. My point is, today we come and we talk about the expense of our sin by looking at a hygienic cross in a room that has no blood. And it's hard. So what do? We give you communion cups and talk about the blood of Jesus. But come on, that's all hygienic. And the point is that when you look back in the scriptures, our Hebrew brothers and sisters before us had a graphic picture of their own sinfulness by watching them kill the family pet. Now, how tough is that? I wonder if little children don't stand there with tears in their eyes as they watch that nice, cute little lamb get slain. And then dad reaches down and grabs them and says, that's for our sin. That's for our sin. The point is that blood and death aren't a pretty part of the message, but they're the essence of the message. That's how sin got paid for. It was a bloody, gory mess. I simply argue that Jesus was not crucified in a hygienic church setting on an altar. He was nailed to a tree between two thieves where people talk smut outside of a city and hurled insults and vulgarity at him. He was stripped naked and people mocked him. That is the picture of our salvation. But it's the one that we pretty up and make into a nice organized cross and clean up. And this provides a graphic picture of sin. I need to finish these, but there is also in 29:12, Numbers 29:12, on the 15th day. So let's go another +5, and that starts a week of something else. It's called Sukkot. It just happened. It's the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, think about it for a minute. Tabernacles is, in this journey, the last of the feasts to tell a story. Now, think about the story we told, because back in the spring, we heard all about how we're saved. Here, we've heard that there's no separation of sacred and secular and that there's a high cost of sin, but Tabernacles was all about recalling what part of Hebrew history? What was the Feast of Tabernacles to recall? What did it do? 7 days to remind you of what? Have any of you ever seen a sukkah? Yeah, a sukkah is the kind of little lean-to. Year one students built one. We did not this year because Sukkot came early in the year. If it comes later in the year, sometimes we'll build one. A sukkah is a lean-to, and you have to eat your meals and sleep at least some of the evening out in the sukkah. It's outside. When you go to Israel, you're going to find that the buildings are built, most of them, not to have all the porches go one above the other, because everybody lives in flats. They live in like apartments, but they put the porch on the first floor here, and the one on the second floor there, and the one on the third floor there, and the one on the fourth floor there. Why? Because they have to be able to build a sukkah, and you have to be able to see through the branches to see the stars. And if there's another roof above you, you can't. So even if you only have an apartment on the third floor, you have a little space to build a sukkah. It is a little lean-to. What does it recall? You eat in it, you sleep in it for 7 days. It's a time in the wilderness. And that was a time, notice Go to 29 for a second. 29, 13 to 15. On the first day, 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the second day, 12 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the third day, 11 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the fourth day, 10 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the fifth day, 9 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the sixth day, 8 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the seventh day, 7 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs. On the eighth day, you shall have a solemn assembly. You shall do no laborious work. Down at verse 36, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 lambs, 1-year-old without defect. And you step back and you go, wow, was this an expensive holiday? This was, the nation was to slaughter literally dozens of animals, gallons and gallons of blood. But here's the thing. This was the time to recall God walking us through the wilderness. The last of the festivals was, I want to go with you. The last of the festivals was, when you had nothing, I was there. When you were in the wilderness with nothing more than a lean-to, I was there. It was the worst time in history for the Jews. Cold at night, hot all day, but I was there. Think about it this way. The worst time in Hebrew history, physically, was the high point spiritually. What does that tell you about your life? It tells you that often when you are least comfortable, God is speaking loudest. And when you are most comfortable, God's voice is muffled behind your own comforts. Okay? So you get all the way through 29, and what a marvelous picture that God made available salvation, but we have to personally appropriate it. And God planned that after we were His, there would be cleaning in our lives, and that God had a plan from long ago that would conquer death and raise us in resurrection. And God's plan for Israel was that one day there would be another loaf, one from the world, that would join them. And God refuses to see us segment our life and seclude sacred and secular. And sin has a terrible price, and death and blood are dragged in because of our mutiny from God. And God has been ever faithful to provide what He promised, even when our physical comforts were low, yet He was there. That's the story of the calendar. You know what I love? I love that God has a story behind His calendar. Because I got to tell you, our calendar is not all that interesting. We've got 12 months and it's mostly the same. Do you remember that when God started the calendar and started the day, He started it in darkness and ended it in light? And when man rewrote it, it started in darkness and ended in darkness. And it's worth remembering that God has a story behind all the stuff He bothers to tell you. If He says it, He's got a reason why He says it.